Good afternoon. I'm going to make a video about Larry's ancestor, George Racette Jr. He was quite a well-known person back in the 1800s. I found this article in an Indian Record, October 1965. Manitoba's Great Debt to Riel by Gwyn Hamilton. It was also in the Winnipeg Tribune. And talks about George Racette Jr. And they have a different version of who he was. He was related to Louis Riel. They would have been cousins because the Racette family married into the Gavary family. So this newspaper article, Manitoba's Great Debt to Riel by Gwyn Hamilton. I'm going to read it to you. The people of historic Manitoba may have owed Louis Riel a greater debt than they then knew. When Riel assumed authority in late 1869 to lead the people of Red River through a complicated series of political movements that culminated in the establishment of the province, he killed the dream of an unscrupulous adventurer who was plotting to drench the soil of the prairies in the blood of the settlers. This man was a native of the Red River country, a Métis who was completely unlettered, but who possessed an uncanny knowledge of Indian psychology and an animal cunning that gave him a tremendous influence over the prairie Indians. He was one of Manitoba's real bad men. And yet the name and the story of George Racette Jr. rates only a passing line in most histories, and the full story of this conspiracy can only be pieced together from many sources. Isaac Cowie, who was a Hudson's Bay Company factor on the Qu'Appelle, knew him well and had experienced trouble with him. He described him as a man of monstrous size in build, something between a man and a gorilla. Of course, you know, Isaac Cowie was probably only about 5 feet tall and very tiny. Isaac Cowie, who was a Hudson's Bay Company factor. Racette was also a man of large appetites for food and liquor and Indian girls. Of course, you know, all those traders were painted with that kind of light. And his ambition was as wide and unlimited as the sky that covered his native prairies. Cowie is one of the few men to have written in any detail of this man's ambitious plan to unite the various prairie tribes as well as the Métis. He wielded a substantial influence among the Sioux, particularly those who had sought refuge in Canada after the Minnesota Troubles of 1862. These people, homeless and vagrant wanderers in the Northwest, listened to his proposals with interest. I don't think they were vagrant and wanderers. They've always lived on this land. There is evidence that it was a long-range plan and that it was known to Riel at the time. In the Manitoba archives are 2 signed statements from Indians authorizing Racette to speak and act for them. The two bear dates 10 years apart. The first is dated September 10, 1860, and is signed with the witnessed mark of red stone, described as an Assiniboine chief. This grants me, George Racette, the right of my nation and also the rights of our lands from the long river, the Red, possibly, Red River goes into the United States, to the Assiniboine. The other is dated March 14, 1870, and is from Whitecap, a Sioux then at Wood Mountain, and it reads, "Our idea was to travel on English ground and live with them. We have made peace with the half-breeds, the Chippewas, Crees, and Assiniboines. We have chosen George Racette to speak for us. We give him our rights on both sides of the Missouri." George Racette traveled extensively as a fur trader, and he traveled, you know, all over Saskatchewan, Manitoba, into the United States, to the north. Racette's sense of identity with the Indians was further heightened by his marriage to the two daughters of Red Eagle, another Assiniboine chief. And Cowie said he had further ingratiated himself with Sitting Bulls, Hunkapapa Sioux, through similar marital ties. His nickname was also a clue to his success with the Indians. It was shaman, a term then in vogue on the American frontier to describe an Indian medicine man or witch doctor. They still use that word, shaman. Yeah, his name was G-Man, you know, because he had an Ojibwe or Soto grandmother, Shonanen. So he likely grew up hearing the Ojibwe language or the Soto language, because that's why they called him G-Man. He was a canoe maker, so he made canoes because he was a fur trader, and that's where he traveled, either on horse or in a canoe. And shaman, they still use that word. They call it medicine man or witch doctor, they call it back then. But there's a whole different history here in Evanflow of this man, George Racette Jr. Racette had carefully cultivated the impression among the Indians that he possessed strong medicine. Racette was also known by a number of variants of this name, such as Schumann. That means a raisin in our language. And they used to use raisins to make homebrew. Shaman, and even showman. I can imagine why they would call him that, showman, because of the things that he did. The key to the success of any plan like Racette's was the attitude of the Métis of the Red River. Here was the only group in the whole territory capable of concerted action. Here were people trained and bound by the discipline of their buffalo hunt, but they remained loyal to their leaders. Racette apparently lacked the tact and patience to woo this loyalty. His drinking orgies, in a time and place where such foibles were looked on with charity and understanding, were nevertheless too much for the Red River Métis. Cowie says he was run out of Red River prior to 1869, and he was on American soil when the Métis gave their allegiance to a man they felt was worthy. There was a wondrous rage in the camp of Shaman Racette when he learned of this. I know why. Because George Racette, he was a medicine man. And the island that they call Manitou Island here by the Narrows, he conquered that island. He was not scared when he fasted there in his younger days. And they called that area Manitoba. And Larry's grandfather used to say, we named this Ake, this ground, we named it Manitoba. And when Shaman Racette found out that Louis Riel named our province Manitoba, I can imagine why he would be so outraged. Eh? I don't know if Louis Riel ever fasted on that island. Racette, when he learned of this, he changed his plans to include the Métis when they became tired of this upstart leader named Riel, who excelled in nothing that the Métis held dear, such as riding and shooting. And then, in 1870, when a crisis arose in Red River, Racette saw an opening. W.L. Morton, in the book Manitoba, A History, says that Racette at Portage acted as an agent for John Christian Schultz in stirring up the Portage Sioux. They were on opposite sides of the political stand at that time, those two. One was an Englishman from Ontario, and the others were the Red River Métis. I guess what happened is didn't want to believe in George Racette, and his followers were the native people. That's who he was more with all the time. And this resulted in an Indian scare at St. Boniface. The archivist of the Grey Nuns records something of the fears entertained in that area. On February 16th, this entry was made. A new alarm, they say. The Sioux are arriving to accept the invitation made to them by the English, and that there will be war for sure. All the women and children have left town to put themselves in a safe place. Then there is another entry. The news so much longed for arrives. The Sioux will not advance any further. The reason for this decision on the part of the Sioux was probably the fighting prowess of the Métis. There were 500 men under arms in Fort Garry, and sentries and guard detachments were on duty at all strategic places. The Sioux had experienced the bite of the Métis before, and had no wish to rouse a hornet's nest, which they could not control. Yes, that was their perspective, but I would say something else. I would say that George Racette had a hand in making peace with the Sioux and the Métis. He was a peacemaker, unlike what was written here. And so George Racette's conspiracy started to fall apart. Racette shortly afterwards crossed the American border. In 1875, a providential bolt of lightning extinguished the life of Racette. and removed forever the threat of a concerted and general uprising of the prairie Indians. Racette's companions buried him where he was felled, at his campsite on the Missouri. I want to say that there's a lot of stories that about George Racette that Larry was given by his grandfather. Jean Racette told him lots of stories about this man, and I want to write them down because there's a lot of stories of his being around here. He had every right to be around here because his grandfather was here and his grandmother. And George Racette Jr., yeah, they paint him the way they paint him here, but that's the other side of the story. There's another side that has to be heard. Our stories have to be told, as that's what's happening now. Our stories are being told, and that's what I want to do in making this video. And you can hear that thunder. I'm sitting outside, it's thundering here. It's going across the lake. That's where that thunderbird nest is. And without a doubt, without a shadow of a doubt, we know George Racette, who was also known as Papinet, built that thunderbird nest after being given that gift. That's probably why they called him Showman, because Larry's grandfather, Jean Racette, told him that when he would sit on that nest and begin praying, every time he blinked his eyes, there would be lightning. Imagine that, eh? And he called him the Thunderbird Man, or he called him Papinet. In our language, our Zoto language, it means to live through anything. So thank you for listening. Miwech.